Hello again, and welcome to Bible Class Topics. Today we continue our study of the Gospel of Matthew by beginning our study of chapter 8. This is part 1 of 2 parts. If we look at the outline of our entire study, which we've entitled Jesus Christ, the King of the House of David, we see that we've already discussed the coming of the King, and we're now in a section that we've entitled Proclaiming the Kingdom. Under the heading of Proclaiming the Kingdom, we've already talked about the beginning of the Galilean ministry at the end of chapter 4, and then we spent quite a few lessons talking about the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Today we begin a section that covers chapters 8 and 9 entitled Miracles of Healing. We'll follow that with Sending Forth the 12 and Discourses and Kingdom Parables. I've divided chapter 8 into these sections, and we will try in today's lesson to look at about half of these from verse 1 through verse 15 as I have highlighted here on the chart. Before we even read any of the verses this morning, I want to give us an introduction to chapter 8 and basically some words about chapter 9 as well as we talk about what's going on in these 2 chapters. I've entitled chapter 8 Love in Action, and we will see why we did that. In chapters 5 through 7, Matthew has recounted the words and wisdom of Jesus, and in chapter 8 he will show us that the divine love of Jesus was active. 7 miracles will be accounted for here in this chapter. The leper healed, the centurion's servant, Peter's mother-in-law. We'll talk about those in this lesson, and then the second lesson on chapter 8, we'll see the sick are brought to the door, the reaction of the scribe, the calming of the storm, and the possessed Gergesenes. Gergesene. The possessed Gergesene. I knew how to say it. When we see the leper being healed, we'll see Jesus touching the untouchable. In the story of the centurion's servant, Jesus heals the slave of a Gentile man, a man worthy of being doubly despised in the eyes of the Jews because he was also a Roman soldier. And then with Peter's mother-in-law, we'll see Jesus perform a private miracle. And when we see the sick are brought to the door, we see any man could approach Jesus at any time of the day or night. Why is the reaction of the scribe in this list of 7 miracles? Perhaps it's not a miracle in the usual sense of the word, but to touch the heart of a scribe was not a natural feat in first century Judea. In the story of calming the storm, we'll see the love of Jesus brings peace and serenity in times of turmoil and confusion. And when we see the story of the possessed man in verses 28 through 34, we'll see God's power versus the power of the devil. 4 words used to describe these supernatural events include miracle, something mighty and powerful, a wonder, the impression the miracle made on the witnesses, a work, which is the object itself, a sign, which indicates miracles are not an end to themselves, but an indicator of something else. This is very, very important in our study. Miracles were visible, concrete demonstrations of divine power that pointed men towards God. When Christ performed a miracle, they were marked in at least 4 ways. By their extent, they encompassed nature, they affected material elements, they cured diseases, they affected men, they affected demons, and they even affected death. They were also marked by their success. Jesus never failed to perform a miracle. He's the one doctor who never lost a patient. They're marked also by their immediacy. They were performed instantly and instantaneously. And they were marked by their visibility, performed openly in public view without props or accomplices. Not even his enemies would deny their reality. See John 11, verse 47. Before we go on, let's take a moment and read the first 15 verses of chapter 8. When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him, and behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion Jesus said, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. And when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law, that is, Peter's mother-in-law, lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. Let's talk about leprosy, sometimes called the living death. It's the most terrible disease of the ancient world. Nodules would appear, then begin to ulcerate inside the throat, the hands, and the feet. None of these places were rarely spared. This type of leprosy can last up to 9 years before the victim succumbs to mental decay, coma, and then death. In other types of leprosy, nerves are affected. Feeling in the extremities is lost. Fingers and toes and even feet begin to rot and drop off. This type of leprosy can last as long as 30 years. The people treated the leper as if they were the walking dead. Once diagnosed, the leper was removed from society. This was according to the law of Moses, Leviticus 13 and verse 46. In Jesus' day, the leper was barred from Jerusalem and all walled towns. In terms of being defiled, the only thing worse than contacting a dead body to the Jew was touching a leper. The most unbelievable part of this story to a Jewish listener or an eyewitness is that Jesus stretched out his hand and actually touched the leper. What we're talking about here is compassion beyond the law. The leper approached Jesus with confidence. Can a man be too unclean to approach Christ? The rabbis had no prescribed remedy for leprosy, but this man trusted Jesus to be able to heal him. How did he come to Jesus? He came with a humble heart. He said, "If you will." And he came with reverence. He worshiped Jesus, as we can see from the reading from the King James Version. The word describes man's feeling in the presence of divinity. This man knew Jesus was God. Jesus, in turn, reacted with compassion. The law forbade Jesus from coming within 6 feet of this man, and according to medical knowledge of the day, Jesus placed himself at a terrible risk. Jesus knew he had to help this man. The obligation of love took precedence over rules and regulation. In the description below, I provided a link to the lyrics of a hymn we sing entitled The Great Physician, or sometimes The Great Physician Now Is Near. I suggest that you pause the video, go to that link, and read all of the words of that hymn. Jesus ordered the man to keep silent about the healing. We see Jesus does this often in Matthew 9:30, 12:16, 17:9, Mark 1:34, 5:43, 7:36, 8:26. Why did Jesus often command silence? Well, the rebels, and there were many among the Palestinians, would have attempted to install someone with such power as their political and military leader. He asked these people to be quiet about these miracles until he could establish himself as not the physical Messiah, not the worldly Messiah, but the spiritual Messiah. He was not going to be the secular restorer of Israel that the Jews, including his own disciples, had been seeking. Jesus sent the leper to the priest. The law was still in effect for the Jews. This leper must follow the ritual laid out in Leviticus chapter 14 to receive his certificate of cleanliness from the priest. Prayers are not answered for the man who waits lazily for God to act, but prayers are answered for when faith-filled effort of a man is joined by the grace of God. Sending him to the priest would accomplish 3 things. One, it would be a testimony to the priest that he actually was healed, and who healed him by miracle. Now the priests have heard of Jesus and of his miracles. It would allow the man himself to be reintegrated into the Jewish society, and it would show that Jesus did respect the law of Moses, which required cured lepers to be certified by a priest. The backbone of the Roman army were the centurions. Let's talk about this Roman centurion for a few minutes. Before we do, I want to read something to you from Barclay in his commentary about centurions. According to Polybius and his description of what a centurion should be in the Roman army, they must not be so much venturesome seekers after danger as men who can command, steady in action, and reliable. They ought not to be over-anxious to rush into the fight, but when hard pressed, they must be ready to hold their ground and die at their post. That's why it said the centurions were the finest men in the Roman army. It's also interesting to note that every centurion ever mentioned in the New Testament was a man of honor. I suggest you do a little study on the word centurion in the New Testament and read about the other ones mentioned. What set this man apart from most slave owners was his attitude toward his servant. In general, the Romans cared very little for their slaves, and they were basically a denarius a dozen. Slaves were not even considered people. They were simply considered a thing. The only difference between a slave, an animal, and a tool was that a slave could speak. Perhaps it was this man's unusual and unexpected gentleness and love that moved Jesus to give blessings to a Gentile and his slave. This man possessed the passport of faith. This man was a man of faith. If he knew the Jewish law, and he most certainly did, he knew Jesus could not even enter his house. His faith was so great that he knew Jesus did not even have to come to the servant to heal him. Faith is the only passport to the blessedness of God. The Jews needed to learn this fact. It is faith, not birthright, that brings us into God's presence. Faith that is not under God's authority is no faith at all. Faith that is not obedient to God's authority is no faith at all. See James 2:14 through probably the end of that chapter. That's where James, the Lord's brother, says faith without works is dead. Jesus refers to the great banquet the Jews expected at the Messiah's coming. This is from extra-biblical writings. The Jews were not expecting any Gentiles to attend this banquet. Yet Christ tells this centurion those with faith will attend regardless of their birth, and in the place of some who were born Jewish. The Messiah belongs to every person who will follow him. Only those who believe as the centurion believed will sit at the table with Jesus and Abraham, so says Richard Gardner. We can call Jesus' power the power which destroys distance. The disciples had seen Jesus heal someone who he contacted, but never at such a distance. Does this make the miracle harder or easier to believe? Personally, to me, it makes it easier to believe. I'll let you think on that and see how you come up with an answer. We'll conclude our study today with a look at a miracle at Peter's house in verses 14 and 15. According to Mark's account, this miracle took place in Capernaum on a Sabbath day. Commentators believe Peter's mother-in-law was suffering from malaria. What can we learn about Jesus and the woman from these verses? First, let's talk about Jesus. On this day, Jesus had healed a demon-possessed man. We can tell that from Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. Then the centurion's servant, and now Peter's mother-in-law. In this instance, there is no crowd to look on and be astounded. The point is this: Jesus was never too tired to help and did not depend on an audience to bring forth his powers. Concerning the woman, what did she do with her newfound health? From the passage we see she used her gift to serve others. Thank you for watching today. Next time, in our study of the Gospel of Matthew, we will conclude our study of chapter 8. Please give this video a like and please subscribe to our channel. It would be much appreciated. Until we speak again, may God bless.